Mr. John Shoraka. He's the Managing Director of Government Contract Pros. He has assisted small businesses and government contractors in the phases of all their business life cycle, including navigation of the federal marketplace, business development, certification programs, and so much more. And we're going to hear from John this morning. And he likes to wander around the room, but now you're on this stage and you can't go too far. So,
I will try to stay put. Will this pop up over there?
Oh, yes.
Oh,
So there it is.
Thank you.
And I think the clicker is there it is.
Okay. Thank you, guys. Good morning. I'm just going to get settled a second. I do want to thank, this is an awesome campus. So thank you to Nike for having us here. I had the pleasure of driving around for a little while trying to figure out where the parking was, but it gave me an opportunity to see the entire campus, and it's beautiful and amazing, so thank you. Thank you for the National Center for partnering with us. We've done a lot of these events, as Yvette mentioned. We've been all around Indian country. We've been to Alaska. We've been to Hawaii. It's trying to share the importance, at least in this session, of federal contracting and the benefits it provides to the community and is intended to provide to the community. Yeah. So what I really wanted to sort of talk, and the slides, there's long slides, and I know I have 2 hours. I don't want to bore anybody. I used to teach at one point at Catholic University, and at one of the reviews, one of the students said, because we have to read our reviews, right, said, well, it was an interesting class, but he has a monotone voice and sometimes puts me to sleep. So I don't want to put you guys to sleep. I do want to try and keep it interactive. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand. The slides, are going to go over the basics of the program with respect to federal contracting, the set-aside programs, what are they, how are they enforced. Then it'll talk a little bit about some tools to use to expand your company as you sort of grow it, like mentor-protege and joint venture. And then we can talk a little bit about certain trends that are going on in the federal marketplace. It can sometimes be sort of a headwind with respect to newer entrants and some of the challenges that they face. But we'll talk about those things. But what I'd like to try to do is go at your pace, focus on the areas that make more sense for you guys, and have a more open discussion today. How many folks are currently in federal contracting out there? Current government contractors, okay? How many folks are looking to enter as a new entrant in federal contracting? Okay. And then how many folks are looking at the 8A program, the set-aside program that has the opportunity? Okay, okay, good, good. So we have a good mix. So one of the things that I guess I'd always sort of focus on is understanding just the basics of the federal marketplace, right? If you're in the private sector, you're already engaged in providing services or a product, the federal government is always a potential and interesting client. A lot of times folks will be reluctant because it seems like a maze from the outside looking in. And so a couple of things. One is I was at the SBA, Small Business Administration. I had a great opportunity to work with Chris James closely as he ran the Office of Native American Affairs and then as he ran the field office for SBA. And so I was responsible for all the set-aside programs, the federal government set-aside programs. And then before that, I actually was a government contractor. So my dad had started a company and I helped manage and grow that company for about 20 years before I went to the SBA. And since then, after leaving the SBA, I've been doing advisory work for small businesses. So as you look at the federal marketplace, number one, if you're in it already, and number two, if you're looking to pivot into the marketplace, sometimes it can sort of be a maze, right? Because it sometimes looks like there's so many different opportunities and buying activities. There are resources where potential projects or opportunities are listed, but oftentimes just responding to those doesn't gain you traction. It's sort of like a shotgun approach as opposed to a strategic approach. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But the one thing that I'll say, having been both outside and inside government with respect to these programs, the one thing that I'll say is that when you develop a foothold in the federal marketplace, and you gain traction, the federal government can be the best client in the world, right? They're the largest buyer of goods and services in the world. They have a requirement to set aside contracts for small businesses, right? So 23%, and that's roughly $120 to $150 billion every year. And then in addition to that, they have a requirement to further set it aside with what we used to call the 5533, right? So 5% for small disadvantaged businesses and the 8A companies, and we'll talk about that. 5% for women-owned small businesses, 3% for service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses, and 3% for hub zone companies. And every year, the federal government pretty much meets these goals. And by the way, through executive order, not through statutory change, the Biden administration increased the first goal, the small disadvantaged business 8A goal, to a target of 15% by 2025. Last year it was 11%, and they met it. This year it's going to be 12%, so it's going to slowly go up, right? So if you can qualify for the 8A program, or you can represent it as small and disadvantaged, I would encourage you to do so, because the federal government is looking for new partners that are socially and economically disadvantaged. There's been a lot of changes recently at the SBA with respect to several of these programs. With respect to 8A, it's a front-end full certification program, right? So there are requirements to submit to the agency. They'll review it. The requirements are with respect to, is your company small? Am I socially disadvantaged? And am I economically disadvantaged? And I'll go sort of through those and talk about what does that mean. But if you can qualify with respect to those thresholds, the 8A program, which is a 9-year program, can be very beneficial, because not only does the government has goals which are actually increasing over the next several years, but the government has tools which aren't in the other programs to direct award. They call it sole source opportunities within a particular threshold directly to your company, right? So no competition. The contracting officer doesn't have to do a whole full-blown justification and approval. Within the $4 million threshold, they can sole source an award to a company if they find that the company can meet, the requirements, qualifications, right? So it's a really effective tool for growth, but it is a 9-year program. And so you want to get into the program where you can leverage it successfully. Sometimes companies will get in real quick. When they first start off, they don't have the relationships with the federal contracting officers or the federal programs or the small business offices, and they end up sort of wasting their first 2, 3, 4 years in the program just gaining that traction. And then you're looking at graduating for the program, because in years 7, 8, and 9, you're sort of in the transitionary stage. And by the way, in the transitionary stage, they limit the amount of sole source opportunities you can get. So you kind of get weaned off of them. So if you're looking at the 8A program, I would make sure that you can leverage the entire 9 years. Over the last several years, because of the COVID pandemic, the program for existing participants was increased by a year, because 2020, there wasn't a lot happening. You couldn't do events, you couldn't do matchmaking. And so for newer participants, it was really difficult to gain traction. And we'll talk a little bit about the trends as well with respect to what happened in the pandemic. But I'd encourage you to look at the 8A program if you think you can qualify. We'll talk through the qualifications. But the other thing that I'd say is, if you can have multiple certifications, so the other front-end certification, which used to be self-representation, is woman-owned. So if you can certify for 8A and woman-owned, I'd encourage you to do that. Hub Zone, another one. The reason for this is a buying activity can't do multiple set-asides. Like, they have to pick. Is it going to be 8A, Hub Zone, service-disabled, or woman-owned? That part is true. However, they can get credit for anything that you're certified as. So even though they do a set aside as an 8A, they can get quadruple credit if you're the unicorn and have all those certifications. So the more certifications you have, if you're eligible for them, I'd encourage you to pursue them. And that allows you and makes you more attractive because the federal government has these goals and they're looking for small businesses that'll help them meet these goals. One of the things I used to do at the SBA, my office was responsible for, was establishing the goals for all the federal agencies. It is 23%, but every agency has a different goal. And SBA does an analysis. We'd analyze, are you buying small business friendly stuff? If you are, you're gonna have a high goal. Like the agency itself, the SBA had like a 72% goal small business because we bought things that were small business friendly. Department of Energy, on the other hand, nuclear stuff, labs, all sorts of things, their goal was 10%. Why? They didn't necessarily buy stuff that was super small business friendly. We always encouraged them and sort of pushed them up. So one of the things is just who has high goals, right? And who has goals that meet my socio categories. And so that's one lens of looking at agencies. And if you go to USA Spend, there used to be a really good website that was Small Business Government Contracting, I think it was called. And it was a government website that actually had all the goals and then would track performance against those goals. That hasn't been updated recently, which is something that really SBA should probably do. But they do release scorecards every year. So if you go to the SBA website and look up their scorecards, they'll let you know what the agency goals are and how they did in the last year. So if they're not meeting their hub zone goal and your hub zone, and by the way, of these goals, the SBA or the federal government generally meets the 23% goal. It's been like around 25%, so there's talk about increasing that. Generally will meet the 8A goal because it's kind of easy to do the sole source stuff. So they actually, when they say they increased the goal from 5 to 11%, that was a campaign promise from the Biden administration, but the federal government was already usually hitting 10% anyway. So it's really a 5% stretch, right? And then women-owned, they've met a few times. Service disabled since 2012. Do we have any service disabled veterans, by the way? We may have some online. So first of all, thank you for your service. My son, I'm going to throw this in there, is actually graduating from basic training next week. So looking forward to going to that graduation, but thank you for your service. The federal government has met that goal. The one goal that the federal government has always had difficulty meeting is the hub zone goal. And so if you think you can qualify as a hub zone, I encourage you to do that as well. So what are the basics of the systems? Now, the guys that already have companies, I'll talk about this. And so let me just stop there so far. Any questions so far about anything I've talked about with respect to the set-asides, the overall sort of structure of how the federal government buys small, the spend, those types of things? Any questions? Yeah, so I can, and then we can delve deeper as we go through the slides. So, great question. 8A, if you're socially and economically disadvantaged, you can apply to the 8A program. Socially, there's presumed classes. Native American is one, African American, Hispanic American, Asian Pacific Islander. There are presumed classes with respect to being socially disadvantaged. Economic disadvantage, there are certain thresholds. Your gross income for the last 3 years has to be below $350,000, and these are in the slides, and we'll make these slides available, right? It has to be below $350,000. Your net assets have to be below $750,000. Net assets doesn't include your principal residence and your retirement accounts. And your total assets have to be, so you throw those all back in for total assets, have to be below $6 million. So that's socially disadvantaged and economically disadvantaged. If you can meet those, and that's why the certification process can sometimes be painful, because SBA wants to analyze your documents to demonstrate that you meet those two requirements. So that's how you get 8A certified. Hub zone stands for historically underutilized business zones. The SBA doesn't establish those zones. It's actually a HUD, Housing and Urban Development Analysis. They have maps that analyze, economic conditions, unemployment, poverty, et cetera. And based on that analysis, they develop a map of where hub zones exist. SBA has actually a really good website where you put in your address and it'll tell you if you're in a hub zone. Now, your principal office has to be in a hub zone to qualify for the hub zone program. Your principal office doesn't mean your headquarters. It means where most employees work out of. And with people working remotely and in the pandemic, et cetera, there's been some flexibility there. And you can exclude your project site employees. If you have project site employees that are at a government installation, et cetera, you can exclude those guys. Then you look at the balance of employees and you say, okay, the most of them work out of this office, that's your principal office. You can switch that. If you have two offices and one of them is in a hub zone and the other one isn't, you can move one person from here to here, and then now you qualify for that first requirement. So hub zone, principal office in a hub zone. The second requirement for the hub zone program is that 35% of your employees live in a hub zone. It's an economic development program, right? So they want businesses in underserved communities. So if you have 35% of your employees living in a hub zone, not the same hub zone, any hub zone, then you meet the two requirements for the hub zone program. An employee is anybody that works more than 40 hours a month. So there's a lot of firms that will hire interns, right? Like college students. Colleges are usually in a hub zone because college towns are usually hub zones. They'll hire college students as an intern, 40 hours a month, build up their hub zone employees. Now you meet that requirement too. So that's the hub zone requirement. The other two, women-owned and service-disabled, are, what they say. The principal owner has to be either service-disabled, in the case of SDVOSB, or woman-owned, or a female. And all of these programs, well, I shouldn't say all, in the 8A program, the disadvantaged individual in the SDVOSB program and in the women-owned program, the individual that the certification is based on has to own 50% and control. A lot of times you get into issues around control. What does that mean? So one of the things that the SBA looks at, in addition to do you meet the requirements, is do you really control the company? A lot of folks, you might have a minority partner that lends you a lot of money. There are certain things that can potentially impact control that doesn't necessarily come to mind for small businesses. And we can talk through those as well. When we talk, if you have any questions, again, feel free to ask. But those are sort of the basics of the certification programs. On the SDVOSB, for our audience, there historically and traditionally had been two programs. One ran by the VA that required you to be front-end certified in order to get a contract at the VA. Every other federal government agency used the self-certification, self-representation. You go into SAM and self-represent. That's changing in January of 2023, so it's coming up. Everybody is going to now have to be certified in the SDVOSB program up front, and the process is moving to the SBA. So SDVOSB certification, basically all the programs now are front-end certification. And so unless you just represent the small, and you can do that too. You can just represent a small, and there are set-asides that occur that are just vanilla small business, not one of the socio categories. Any other questions before we sort of talk about the basics of the systems? Feel free to engage. I'll be here later too, but feel free to engage. A lot of times it's good questions from the audience that sort of keeps the discussion going, but helps us go dig deeper or delve deeper into issues that you guys are concerned about. Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. Can you explain why you said the program is a 9-year program?
Yeah. So once you get into the program, you graduate from the 8A program in 9 years. It's considered a business development program. And so it has a development phase, which is from years 1 through 5, and I could be wrong, it could be 1 through 6, and then a transitionary phase for the last 4 years. And so you get assistance from the agency, and when you get certified, you're assigned a business opportunity specialist at your local district office, SBA district office, and you get assistance over that time period from your BOS, and there's 7J training, and there's all sorts of other things that you can potentially qualify for. But it is a limited time period. After those 9 years, you're a graduated 8A. You cannot compete on 8A set-aside contracts anymore, and you can't be awarded sole source direct award contracts anymore. So that program is limited in duration. The other categories, socio categories, are not limited in duration. As long as you meet the program requirements, you can continue to be in those programs. So, yeah, yes, sir. Yeah. Unfortunately, no. So it was for firms that were affected. They did extend it once, and I'll double check that because it was for firms that were affected by the pandemic through 2021. So the date was like September 30th, 2021, if you got into the program before that. But remind me to send our staff that question. I think they extended it, but I don't think they extended it into 2022. When did you get in? Is it, it's a tribal-owned entity? Yeah. See, the benefit, so here's the other thing, and we were going to talk about this. The benefit with a tribally owned entity, and I'm sure you know this, is you're not limited to one 8A, right? So you can create 8A number 2 and 8A number 3, et cetera. There are some restrictions on the NAICS codes that you pick and future companies, and you have to be out of an industry for 2 years before you drop a new one in. But that is really the benefit. So you could always pop in a second 8A. It has been, so that's a good comment as well. It has been challenging with the SBA with respect to certifications. It has slowed down. Unfortunately, 18 months isn't that uncommon. A lot of our clients have experienced, tribal clients, because it's more complex, have experienced maybe 9 to 12 months from when you get it in. And then individual clients, once you get it in, it's usually like at least, they say 90 days. That's their statutory requirement, but they haven't been meeting that. And look, so they're under, and I'm former SBA, I had to deal with this too. I ran these offices. They're understaffed. And they have significant responsibilities, and those responsibilities keep increasing, right? So now they have this VETS program too, and their funding isn't increasing, right? So things are slower. So for an individual firm, at least for our clients, it's been taking closer to 4 to 6 months. Appeal, how long the application takes? Oh, yeah, that's a good question. So what date, so 18 months before January 2022 is when it was submitted. That's a really good question. I mean, Chris and I both stay really close and in touch with the agency, so I can ask that question. Yeah, definitely. So in other words, you applied, we're still in the pandemic, but it took more than 18 months to get certified. You didn't have access to the benefits of the program. Yeah, okay. Any questions, by the way? So how many more other potential, I call them entity owned, because, yeah, the one thing that I didn't mention yet is that tribally owned entities have special, and when I say tribally, I mean tribe, Alaska Native Corporation, the regionals and the village corporations, and then Native Hawaiian organizations. They have certain special benefits in the program. They can own 8A companies. They can have multiple 8A companies. And yes, they are in the program for the 9 years, but they can set up 8A number 2, 8A number 3, 8A number 4, et cetera. How many other like entity-owned type of companies or potential companies do we have out there? Anybody else from like a native? Okay, okay. Is it a village corp?
It's one of 4 urban village corporations.
Oh, neat.
If that makes sense, urban village.
Neat. Cool. Yeah, so that's definitely and look, so when we talk about the 8A program in the entity owns with the SBA, and there were some recent proposed rules published in the entity owned world, some of the requirements are different, right? So when you apply to the program, for Alaskan Native corporations, you don't have to, because of ANCSA, you already are determined economically disadvantaged. So you don't have to demonstrate the economic disadvantaged status. I'm sorry, you're both automatically economically and socially disadvantaged. So that application is significantly easier. For tribal entities, you're automatically socially disadvantaged, but you have to determine and prove that the underlying tribal population is economically disadvantaged. And a lot of times that first 8A application, that's why it takes a long time. Once you do that the first time, your second 8A, third 8A, fourth 8A is a lot easier. And then for Native Hawaiian organizations, it used to be that, which was odd, and we changed this when we were at the agency, it used to be that the board members of the Native Hawaiian organization, which is a nonprofit, had to be economically disadvantaged. That didn't make a lot of sense because why wouldn't you want to get, the best board members for your organization? So that rule was changed where the underlying population that the nonprofit is supporting has to be economically disadvantaged. So we've seen a proliferation of sort of Native Hawaiian organization and their 8As in recent years. We actually have a lot of clients that are entering as NHOs recently. Yes, sir.
So what about those tribes that are next to like larger cities and stuff? And so are they included in the MSAs? And
Yeah.
Are they disadvantaged because for example, in Arizona, the tribes around Phoenix, if you go to the reservation, there's a lot of light, but they're next to Scottsdale.
Yep.
And so by category, is the tribal reservation disadvantaged and therefore you can benefit from these programs?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So tribes have to demonstrate that the underlying population is disadvantaged. First of all tribal land is hub zone land, which I didn't mention before. So there's a special way for tribes to participate in the hub zone program as well. But the tribe has to demonstrate that the underlying tribal population that it's going to support is economically disadvantaged. And so SBA will want to see economic data, poverty data. You have to demonstrate like education level, access to health, access to roads and infrastructure. Those are the things that can demonstrate that the tribe itself, the population, is disadvantaged. We even have, and SBA has had this, where the tribe itself may actually, because of gaming or access to resources in the ground, may actually have significant funds or availability of funds and resources. And I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but they've been able to establish a Section 17, which is an entity registered and organized under the Department of Interior as an economic development entity. And then that economic development entity has applied to the 8A program as a representative of the tribe. And so even though the tribe has significant potential wealth and access to assets, the Section 17 as an economic development entity doesn't. And so, but you still have to demonstrate that benefits are flowing back to the community, right? They're going back. You can have outside investors, but the portion that the tribe owns, the profits should be going back to the community. Great question. And then with respect to the Hub Zone program for tribes, and this is unique to tribes alone, not the ANCs and the NHOs, for tribes, they can qualify for the Hub Zone program through an exemption. So instead of meeting the 35% requirement of employees in a Hub Zone and your principal office in a Hub Zone, you can apply to the program through the tribal exception and say, I promise, I don't meet any of those, but I promise if I get a Hub Zone contract, 35% of the staff on that Hub Zone contract will come from our community or one of the surrounding communities around the tribal land. So in fact, if it's in Phoenix, that's probably a benefit because you probably have access to more potential staff for that contract. If it's really rural, it becomes difficult to meet that promise. But here's the thing. So I know I'm getting in the weeds, but this is good because we wanted to focus on where the questions are, right? But here's the thing. If you're a tribe and you get 8A certified, right, you can check the box and say, hey, I promise if I win a HubZone contract, I will hire 35% of the staff from my community or surrounding areas. But then you never bid on a HubZone contract, right? You only go after 8A contracts. But guess what? The contracting officer gets 8A credit and HubZone credit, right? Because it's an 8A set aside, so you don't have to meet the HubZone requirement of having 35% of your staff from your tribe. So they still get the HubZone credit. So that's sort of a loophole, but it's a benefit to the tribe and it's a benefit to the contracting agency and the buying activity because they get double credit. Does that make sense? Okay. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah. So the question was, and that's a justification and approval threshold. So the question was another great example with respect to the differences between individually owned and entity owned, right? NHO, tribe, ANC. Individually owned thresholds for sole sources of 4 million and 7 for manufacturing. For tribes and ANCs, the threshold, there is actually unlimited sole source authority. At $22 million in the civilian world and at $100 million in the DoD world, the contracting officer has to do an extra step if they go over those thresholds. They have to write a justification and it has to be approved by the head of contracting activity. So it's a little tougher. Like when those requirements came about in 2010, it was, I think, the Small Business Jobs Act of 2010, you saw a little bit of a chilling effect, we called it, with respect to sole source awards above those thresholds. But sole source awards above the thresholds do occur and can occur, but they need that extra J&A, the justification and approval. For NHOs, Native Hawaiian organizations, they have unlimited sole source authority, but only at the Department of Defense. And the J&A is at 100 million at the Department of Defense for them. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Hold on. What the reporting requirements are for these programs?
Yeah, good question. So once you get into the program, for the 8A program, there's an annual review process for both individual and entity owned, right? So every year there's an annual review. They look at your business plan to see if you're meeting your targets. When you get into the program, you have to do a business plan. It has to get approved by your business opportunity specialist. They will analyze that. They'll analyze your financials and see if you're tracking towards your targets. But they will also analyze to see if you're still small as a company, if you still meet the requirements of the program, right? Are you still economically disadvantaged? If you do grow significantly, and this does happen from time to time, I mean, it's a benefit. If you do grow significantly, you have to early graduate from the program. In other words, if you are no longer small, we just had a tribal client where they were in their 6th year of the 8A program, but their annual revenues started pushing 60 million. And so it's a 5-year look-back period, and their NAICS code, North American Industry Classification Code, was IT services, which was 37 million and below is small, so they had to early graduate or voluntarily withdraw from the program because they were no longer small. So yes, in the 8A program, in the HubZone program, there's an annual recert. Every 3 years, there's a full recert. In the WOSB program, there's an annual requirement to the other programs are a lot simpler with respect to their annual requirements, but there's still an annual requirement to meet program requirements. Yeah, good question. So the basics of the systems, I know there's some firms that are already in federal contracting and some that are looking at it, but the one thing that I'll say, and we talked about this, right? We talked about shotgun approach versus sort of a very strategic approach. If you do the shotgun approach, a lot of firms and a lot of individuals get frustrated, right? Because every requirement over $25,000 is actually in SAM, right? The System for Award Management. The government has a ton of acronyms. I used to run a lot of these programs, but I always forget them. But number one, you have to be registered in SAM to work with the government, right? So that's sort of step number one. Number two, when you go to get registered, it can be a little painful. And SAM was recently updated where they went from DUNS numbers that are issued by Dun & Bradstreet to UEIs that are issued by GSA, and there's been a whole mix-up. And then the DLA has to issue you a CAGE code, Defense Logistic Agency. Don't ask me, I still haven't figured out why DLA originally got that task, but it's still their task. So DLA has to issue the CAGE code, then it has to verify against your EIN, your employee identification number, and all that has to come together in a sort of a brand new system, and all the check marks have to check to have an active SAM profile. One thing that I'll say is as soon as you start the process, you're gonna get 1 million emails from a whole bunch of consultants that'll say, I'll get you registered for, I don't know, $250, $500, $1,500, whatever it is. The one thing that I'll say is that the PTAC, the native PTAC, can help with that process. There are consultants that do that. Some of our clients are like, we're setting up a new entity, can you just take care of it? Because when the DLA sends you your verification email, if you don't respond in 3 days, you have to start it all over again. And if you miss it because it goes in your junk box, too bad, you have to start all over again. So some people just don't want to deal with it, but you should be able to do it yourself, and the native PTAC should be able to assist you if you're running into hiccups. But that's step number one, like register in SAM, right? And once you register in SAM, yes, ma'am? Yep.
If, say, I want a Native American business.
Yeah, so the question was like, can buyers, either buyers or potential partners or anybody that's actually wanting to do research. Nowadays, SAM has been updated that even if you're not a government person, you're just a private sector person. First of all, there's different views. Government officials can get into SAM and they have more access to data. But the general public can also go into SAM and do research. And so you could look for 8A companies, you can look for HubZone companies, you can look for keywords. So that can be done. You have to create an account, but anybody can do that. So once you register, and to create an account doesn't mean you register. Like I go in there and search companies and profiles all the time. And the other thing that you can do, either in SAM or USA Spend, is track buying data. So every contract over $25,000 is in USA Spending, right? So not only in SAM can you sort of track, who's small, who's 8A, et cetera, which by the way, the official system of record is dynamic small business search, and we'll talk about that in a second. But before I forget my sort of trend of thought, or train of thought, is it trend or train? I don't know, either, on USA Spending. The reason it's such a unique tool is, first of all, how many people have used it? Okay, a few. It used to be Federal Procurement Data System, and that underlying data system still is there, but USA Spending is much more user-friendly. So it has every contract over $25,000 historically that's been issued by the federal government, right? So you can do searches, like you can do North American Industry Classification Code, NAICS code searches. You can do keyword searches. You can do product service code searches. So you can see who's buying what I'm selling, basically, right? Because the one thing we tell our clients is, rather than just waiting for a requirement to come out on SAM and then responding to that requirement, first of all, a lot of time your competitors have been tracking that for like 18, 24 months. They put their teams together. They've probably talked to the small business specialists at the agency. They've probably talked to the program office, so you're sort of behind the 8 ball. So if you had a way of knowing who was buying what you're selling, and then looking to say, okay, what are the top 10 targets, right? So who's buying the most widgets? That's question number one, right? But you have to kind of get a little deeper into that. It's not just who's buying the most widgets, it's is there a plurality of contracts? Because there might be a one widget contract, I don't know, at Aberdeen base, right? For $10 billion. Well, you're probably not going to be awarded that unless you're a native organization that wants to go after that sole source opportunity. But if you're not, you want to look at plurality of opportunities, right? So number one is who are the top 10? Then you want to sort of drill down and be like, okay, is there one huge or two huge contracts, or are there like thousands of contracts? And then you want to see how they're buying it, right? Are they buying it on one-off contracts, or are they going off a GSA schedule, or are they going off a government-wide acquisition contract? So there are government-wide contracts like, they call them GWACs or IDIQs, like Oasis, Alliant, CIOS P4. Those are government-wide contracts where multiple vendors get on them, and then the government can buy off of them. But you can't sell to them if they're using that government-wide contract because you don't have that contract. So it's also figuring out how the buying activities are buying. And then the other thing is, are they small business friendly? Like, is there a lot of small business set-asides going along in this industry at this buying activity? Is there a lot of 8A sole source awards going on? Is there a lot of 8A hub zone awards going on? Because that sort of starts to peel away the onion with respect to not doing the shotgun approach. It is more targeted strategy on who's buying the widgets and how they're buying it. And is it relevant to what I'm selling and how I'm selling it? Or maybe it's like, you know what, they only use Alliant or Oasis. Then the question is, okay, when is the open period to get on that vehicle? Or is there someone on the vehicle that I can be a subcontractor to? So it starts to develop your strategy for growing your pipeline as you peel that onion away. And just like the federal government has the 235533, large prime contractors like a Lockheed or a Northrop or an AECOM or a Boeing, they have small business subcontracting goals as well. So they have to engage small businesses, 8As, hub zones, women-owned, service-disabled. So they're looking for potential partners. And I'll put a plug in here as well, because at Res, they have matchmaking, and not only are federal agencies usually there, but a lot of those large prime contractors are there as well. So it's a good opportunity to sort of get in front of, but I would do my homework before, right? You don't want to get in front of someone that's not buying widgets or doesn't have a large widget contract. You want to do your homework before to figure out, hey, I can do this, I just need to get in front of the right person. And then once you sort of identify the buying activity, what a lot of folks tend to do, and you know, when I was outside government, I probably am guilty of this as well. What a lot of folks tend to do is go straight to the contracting officer, right? The procurement official. Well, that's one good target, but the procurement official is just executing the contract based on their client. Their client's the program office, right? So when I was in government, my program office was government contracting and business development. We used to buy, you know, support services. We used to buy IT services. Chris's program office was Office of Field Operations. He bought consulting services, support services, IT services, et cetera. So it's important to know the contracting office, but it's also important to know the program office. Like, who's the ultimate client here? Can I get in front of them? Are they going to be at an event or a matchmaking so I can tell them about my great product or system or service? Then the last sort of leg of that three-legged stool, right? So procurement official, program official. The last leg is the small business office. How many folks know what a OSBP or an OSDBU is? Okay, so every federal agency, you know how they're establishing those goals, right? So SBA establishes their goals. Every federal agency has an official that's responsible for meeting that goal. They're the director of OSDBU, Office of Small and Disadvantaged Business Utilization, right? So they're the OSDBU director. Some agencies, like the Department of Defense, call that office OSBP, Office of Small Business Programs. So it's one or the other, right? And I think DHS recently changed theirs to be OSBP as well. But so you want to make sure you are working those three tracks at the same time. How do I get in touch with the contracting officer? Am I tracking the projects? When are they expiring? Who's the incumbent? Was it a sole source set aside? Was it an 8A set aside? Am I qualified for this? who's the program office, who's the acquisition office, and what's the small business office that's in charge of this buying activity. And for smaller agencies, first of all, SBA doesn't have an OSDB because by statute they don't have to and they never established one. Every other agency has to have one. So for smaller agencies, there's just one office. For large agencies, like the DoD has OSBP for all of DoD, and then they have an OSDB for Air Force, Army Corps, Navy, Army, et cetera, right? But it doesn't even stop there. So Aberdeen, I gave you guys an example of Aberdeen. Aberdeen has its own small business specialist. And that small business specialist is gonna, and that, so the goals trickle down, right? So let's say the goal for the DoD was, I remember, something like 22%. The Office of Small Business Programs at DoD says, you know, Army, you guys can make 40%. You guys hit 40%, but Navy, you guys buy, you know, big ships. You guys hit 12%, but on average, we'll meet our goal. And then those go down the track, right? So then Army says, well, wait a second, how are we going to meet 40%? They look at Aberdeen and go, wow, you guys buy a lot of small business stuff. You guys are going to do 72% because you'll help us meet our goal. So every small business, every buying activity at the DoD, like Aberdeen, will have a small business specialist assigned. And so it's also important to figure out where that office is. Are they doing that? If Aberdeen's your target, are they doing matchmaking? Are they having industry days? Because they'll have industry days where their large prime contractors will come in and they'll have small businesses come in, because those small business specialists, their job is to meet that goal. So they're looking for qualified small businesses to help them meet that goal, right? But again, yes. So you can try to get FaceTime with them. Yes, that's their job. They're supposed to do, now look, because that's one of the reasons the program was extended, right? Because of COVID, they weren't doing matchmaking or industry days or those things, but you should be able to get FaceTime with them. They should be doing events. Which one? There was one agency, I think it was Treasury, that transitioned to online and it worked out really well. And so they're continuing to do that. But they have a requirement. And by the way, the Obama administration, I keep saying Obama administration. Sorry, that's who I worked for. The Biden administration has as a policy casting a broader net and bringing in more new entrants. So all the OSDB directors and small business specialists are tasked with, you guys need to go out, do more events, meet more firms, bring in new participants in federal contracting. That is a specific initiative under this administration. So tracking those, and by the way, there used to be a really good website, osdbu.gov, which used to have a link to everybody's small business office. That also hasn't been updated, and I don't even think it's online anymore. But you can, once you do the analysis of who's buying what I'm selling, how they're buying it, and you identify your like top 10, then it's really who's the small business representative that I need to talk to, and how far down that ladder do I need to go to get to the person that is responsible for these contracts. Any questions so far? No? Okay, so once you get into SAM and you do your registration, it will ask you some questions about number of employees. First of all, it'll ask you your primary industry, which is NAICS code, right? North American Industry Classification Code. And there are tons of NAICS codes. You're supposed to pick the NAICS code that is the predominant industry that you work in. So if you already have contracts, if you're already doing, sometimes your accountant will pick a NAICS code and not necessarily be the NAICS code that represents your work. And then when you go apply for the 8A program, you have to explain that, you know, the accountant picked this, my real NAICS code is this. And so it sometimes messes things up, but it's supposed to be the predominant industry that you work in. And every NAICS code has a different size standard. So for consulting services, professional services, the NAICS code size standard is, I think it went up to 21 million. For IT services, it's 37.5. For manufacturing, it's employee-based. So shipbuilding is like 1,500 employees. Some manufacturings are up to 250 or 500 employees. So it depends what your primary NAICS code is with respect to, are you small for that primary NAICS code? But you answer some questions, and then once SAM determines that, hey, you're small, it'll actually open up, you don't realize this because it's all sort of interconnected, but it's really opening up a profile for you in DSBS, Dynamic Small Business Search. And a lot of firms don't finish up completing DSBS because you can update your profile, your past performance, all sorts of things in Dynamic Small Business Search, where businesses that are other than small wouldn't be able to do, right? And what a lot of people don't realize is that the market research question you had earlier, contracting officers that are looking for small businesses, one of the tools they often use is Dynamic Small Business Search. So if you're not updating your profile in there, if you're not putting your most relevant experience, they could do a keyword search and your profile might not come up, right? So we have clients, and it's an antiquated system that's like Internet 1.0. Again, not a lot of funding for the SBA. But because it's antiquated, generally the profile that comes up first on the contracting officer research is the one that was updated last. So we have clients that'll go in there and add a sentence 1 month, take out a sentence the next month, put a period, take out a period, just so they come up on top, right? So I'd encourage you at least to update it quarterly so you stay fresh on the list when there's a search. But it is one of the tools that contracting officers use to identify small businesses to do a set-aside, right? Yes, ma'am.
So to keep these, you had said to be relevant in DSBS, you can go in and update your profile, add a period, change a word out. Do you first have to register in SAM? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Because that's the last piece of SAM, and
Correct.
a lot of people forget it.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah, so you have to go through SAM. You have to have your SAM profile. You have to go through SAM. And then when you answer the questions about, revenue and industry and so forth, if it does the math and the system will do the math, then it'll open you up a DSBS profile. SAM is actually owned by the GSA. DSBS is the system of record for small businesses and is owned by the SBA. They're supposed to talk to each other, and sometimes that link breaks. And you have confusion about, wait a second, I'm an 8A, but it's not showing up in SAM, or vice versa, and so that system sometimes breaks. So even if you're not regularly updating it, I would look at your profile and see, does it represent who you are? Both in SAM, quite frankly, and in DSBS. Yes, ma'am.
And you also had mentioned that PTAC centers, Procurement Technical Assistance Centers, can help you navigate through your SAM profile.
Yep.
And there are PTAC centers in every state.
Yep.
And there are also Native American PTAC centers by regions.
Yep.
And a good website to find out who your PTAC is called APTAC, APTAC. Yep.
Very good point. Thank you. Thank you. And the National Center has the native PTACs, right? So DSBS is really important to keep updated. We talked about USA Spend. We talked about SAM. The other thing that I just touch on, in this system isn't updated as much as it probably should, but at least it's a resource. So just like we talked about, large primes have small business goals, right? And a lot of times they don't meet those goals. So they're at industry days, they're at matchmaking, et cetera, but they have the opportunity to list those requirements in SBA's subcontracting network or subnet. So SBA allows large primes, when they're not meeting their goals, to list opportunities here. It's not updated as regularly as it probably should be. Not all large primes are required to use them. And so if you sort of identify where you want to be and they're having an industry day or matchmaking, that's a better solution than subnet, but it's a resource that at least you should look into. Any questions so far? No? Okay. So we talked about getting into SAM, right? And then we talked about your primary industry and your size. So the requirement for going after set-aside contracts is that you're small, right? Now, the requirement to get certified, let's say in the 8A program, is that you're small in your primary NAICS code. Same with HubZone, et cetera. But you can be small in a certain NAICS code and large in another NAICS code, right? That wouldn't preclude you from bidding on an opportunity. Every opportunity, even though you might have outgrown your primary NAICS code and had to voluntarily withdraw from the 8A program, you could still be small for another NAICS code, and you could respond to a proposal for if it was just small business set aside. Now, you graduated from the 8A program, but if it was small business set aside and you were small for the NAICS code assigned to that contract, you could bid on that contract as a small business. You self-represent as a small business. So basically, you're going through SAM, you're self-representing as a small business. You can be protested, though. So if you're bidding on something, you're saying you're small, you're representing you're small, you're checking the boxes, you win, your competitor loses, they can protest to the SBA and say, hey, I don't think this firm is small. That's a point where SBA gets involved on a size protest, requests documentation with respect to your operating agreement, revenues, financials, et cetera, to make sure that you are indeed small for the requirement and you meet the small standard requirements. Any questions there?
You're doing business that's small in a certain NICS code, you can self-promote yourself as a small business on that bid.
Yeah, so if the requirement, so you can be a non-8A participating business, and if you're small for that NICS code, well, you'd have to be in SAM and everything, but you can bid on it. Now that requirement, you can't bid on an 8A set-aside requirement, but if it's a small business requirement, you can bid on that, correct. And there are a good number of just small business set-asides, right? They're not all 8A, HubZone, service disabled, et cetera. And even though it wasn't 8A set-aside or HubZone set-aside or women-owned set-aside, if you are any one of those things, the federal government can take credit, even though they didn't set it aside as a WOSB. In fact, if they do a full and open and you bid on it and you win, and you're small 8A HubZone service disabled, they can still take credit for that. There's a lot of discussion on the Hill with respect to, wait a second, we're meeting this 23% goal, but not all of it is set-aside work. It's full and open too. It just happened to go to a small business. So there's a lot of discussion about, well, maybe the government should only get credit when there's an actual set-aside. But as it stands now, you can get credit, or the federal government can get credit, even if it's a full and open, if the firm awarded is a small business, women-owned, service disabled, et cetera. And again, they can get multiple credit. They get $1 million in each of those buckets. And there's a lot of discussion about, is that fair or right? But yes. Any questions on sort of small? So the main thing is small for your primary code, right, when you're getting certified. And then the other is small for the requirement that you're bidding on. And every proposal, every RFP, every requirement will have a NAICS code assigned. And it's really the contracting officer's responsibility to, I think we talked about this slide. It's the contracting officer's responsibility to pick the NAICS code. Now, we used to call this NAICS shopping because sometimes contracting officers, I like contracting officers, worked with them a lot, good people, overworked. Sometimes contracting officers are like, well, wait a second, if I pick this NAICS code, it's going to limit, it's kind of small, and I won't get all these people or all these firms I want in the competition. So let me pick this NAICS code so it's a little bit larger. Now, the challenge there is, technically speaking, you can't just pick a random NAICS code. It's supposed to be the predominant industry of work for that contract. So there are NAICS appeals, and you can, before a contract opportunity closes, appeal or protest the NAICS assigned. And then the other thing that I'd say is there a slide on this? Yeah, we'll talk about this. You have advocates in federal contracting too, right? One is obviously the Small Business Program Office. So if you're, looking at Aberdeen and all of a sudden you're like, this isn't the right NAICS code, you can call the Small Business Office and be like, hey guys, I think this is, you should take a look at this. You can officially protest it, but that takes a lawyer and a lot of money. You can call the Small Business Office and be like, I think the contracting officer is picking the wrong NAICS code, and they can look at it and at least try to address it. I think we talked about look-back period. So on revenue, it's 5-year look-back period, 5-year average. It used to be 3. They extended it to 5 because the firm used to be able to, have one really good year, and then it would max them out, and they would be out. And then they'd had a whole bunch of bad years, and it took like 3 more years before they could represent as small. So they changed that to 5-year look-back period to sort of even it out. And then on employee-based size standard, it used to be 12-month look back, it's 24. Any questions on sort of NAICS codes and representation as far as small? Okay, so how does set-asides occur? How many folks know what the rule of 2 is? Okay, how many folks know what a PCR, procurement center representative, is? Okay, this is a good slide then. Tell me if you're getting tired of me talking and you want to take a break. Is that allowed? Like a short break? Well, let me go through this slide and then we'll see if people want to take a break or not. Okay, so anything below the simplified acquisition threshold, which is now 250, used to be 150, there's been talk actually to increasing it up to $1 million. And the Biden administration has considered that because everything below the simplified acquisition threshold is reserved for small businesses. In other words, an agency should be hitting 100% on contracts below 250 with small business. Now, first of all, that gets tracked, and agencies have to answer to why they're not hitting 100%. Second of all, there are reasons potentially why something under 250 wouldn't go small. And the easiest example is if an agency needs a Microsoft license, right? It's probably going to be below 250. They're not going to be able to go anywhere else to get the Microsoft license, so that's not going to go small. Some agencies do really well. They're like 98, 97%. Some agencies don't do that well. They're like at 65, 70%. I think the SAT reports are still on USA Spend, or they should be, but that's another place to look. Like, is that agency meeting the simplified acquisition threshold requirement? And should we do, is there room for more growth there? They're being held accountable to that now. And is that an opportunity to go to that agency and say, you guys aren't meeting your SAT, we have a product or service, we can help you meet that SAT threshold requirement. The other thing that you should be aware of, and the reason the Obama administration, the reason why the Biden administration is looking at this is because the simplified acquisition threshold also follows the simplified acquisition procedures, right? So for newer entrants, a lot of times they're like, wow, this is really confusing, all these federal acquisition regulation requirements and all these things I have to certify to and all these steps. The simplified acquisition procedures simplifies a lot of things, and it makes it shorter and easier for the contracting officer to engage with you. So below the SAT, government loves their acronyms, below the SAT, there's SAP, Simplified Acquisition Procedures. So that's number one. Yes, ma'am.
I often get asked, sometimes small businesses have a great entrepreneur mindset, and they want to get into a business. And of course, what they're looking for is like a market research tool to find out what businesses are best of the low-hanging fruit. Like, hey, if I can get a few of these contracts that are $250,000 or less, like where are those? And I often don't know how to answer that question. I know our PTACs can speak better on that, but can you?
Yes, so you can. When we talked about USA Spend and sort of the market research, you can limit your research. Again, USA Spend is a lot friendlier than FPDS, the underlying data set. You can limit your research to contract size. So you could, and you can actually, I think there's a SAT flag as well. So you can look and limit your research to those thresholds to say, oh, look, there's a lot of SAT opportunities in this NAICS code at, I don't know, commerce. And so that'll give you an idea of where those types of opportunities exist. And the smaller contracts are a good way to sort of get your foot in the door, right? And build that past performance and build that relationship, et cetera. So that's a good question. You can do the research on USA Spend to try to limit the requirements to simplified acquisition threshold and below, if that makes sense. Did that answer your question? Okay. So one is the simplified acquisition threshold automatically reserved for small business. The other is the rule of two. Now, what does that mean? That means on requirements above the simplified acquisition threshold, when a buying activity looks to procure a good or service, they're supposed to do market research, right? And that's where DSBS comes in, by the way, Dynamic Small Business Search. They're supposed to do market research, and they're supposed to analyze if there are 2 or more small businesses that can provide the product or the service at a reasonable price, right? That doesn't mean the best price. It means at a reasonable price. So, and it's not a may, it's a shall, right? So technically, the rule of two is a federal requirement, and the oversight capacity comes from the Small Business Administration. And that's where the PCR comes in, Procurement Center Representative. So number one, rule of two. I don't know, the federal government at Aberdeen is going to buy widgets. They're supposed to do market research and say, well, wait a second, there's actually 5 small businesses that can provide this product. We did a sources sought, we did a DSBS search, here it is in the file, so we're going to set this aside. Now, it's the contracting officer's discretion, depending on which goals they need to meet, to say, okay, maybe we'll set it for 8A, women-owned, service-disabled. There used to be a hierarchy that got changed in the Small Business Jobs Act of 2010. So it is really the discretion of the contracting officer to say, I want to meet the 8A goal, or I want to meet the hub zone goal, or women-owned, service-disabled, and then further restrict that competition. But if there are 2 or more small businesses that can provide the product or the service, the federal government shall set the requirement aside. Now, does that always happen? No. What's the recourse? Well, you can engage with the small business office at the agency if there was a sources sought, right? And you responded. Number one, I would respond if you see one. And I'd encourage your competitors and your colleagues to respond as well, so they have a big file. And then it doesn't get set aside, and you're like, look, I know I responded. I know like 2 or 3 of my competitors responded. These keep coming out from this buying activity, and they're not getting set aside, right? So one is engage with the small business office to, make that claim. And then every buying activity has a procurement center representative assigned to it. The sole responsibility of the PCR is to make sure the rule of two is being met. So the PCR, if a requirement doesn't get set aside, the PCR is supposed to sign a form, an SBA form, and I'm going to forget the number of the form, but there's an actual number to it, 729, 479, whatever it was. But they physically have to sign the form saying, I agree with you, you did market research, no 2 or more small businesses, do it full and open, right? So if the PCR is signing off on that, number one, did they actually look at the contract file, and did they agree? Number two, because there are, when I was at the SBA and responsible for the program, I started, and I think there were 219 PCRs that covered all the buying activities across the country. When I left, we had 119. Last count, what I heard is there's like less than 55. So if you can imagine, there's 55 PCRs that cover all the buying activities across the country. So do they look at every contract file and actually sign off on it? They're supposed to, but they don't have the manpower to. So a lot of times it's just like, electronic signature. And then, again, love contracting officers, but just like you have NAICS shopping, sometimes you have PCR shopping. So you wait for the PCR to be on vacation, then you send your requirement to the PCR in Guam, and you say, hey, this is a rush, can you get this done? Here's the requirement. And that guy's like, I'm swamped. Yeah, you need this done today, I'll sign off on it. My colleague's on vacation. The guy on vacation would have known the case much better, might have objected, but you did your PCR shopping and you got to sign off. So in short, what I'd say is that there oversight capacity, at least in a limited fashion, to make sure that the rule of two is met. I'd reach out if you feel that it's not being met, if you know that you responded to a source of sought, if you're seeing requirements that keep coming out and not get set aside. OSDBU, OSBP, we talked about those. That's a good resource. Every buying activity has a PCR assigned to it. So if you go to the SBA website and do PCR directory, you will see which region, they're broken down by region, 6 regions, which region, they call them areas, which area director, and then which PCR is assigned a particular agency or activity. If you need their support, I would reach out and sort of engage them. If you're not getting the PCR to respond, you can go one level up to the area director and engage with the area director. They're usually responsive. I'd start off with the PCR first. Any questions there? Yes, ma'am.
Ever do they get completely used or assigned every year? And
So
if not, do they send a notification out to let people know that these are still available, or do they just open up back to everyone else?
So generally speaking, I guess there isn't like a pool of, there are expiring contracts that are set aside every year, right? Some contracts are 1-year contracts, some of them are going to be 5-year contracts, et cetera. Generally, when that requirement is already set aside, it would be very difficult unless there was justification by the contracting officer to pull it out of the set-aside program. So generally, it would be a recompetition in that set-aside category, and yeah, they're not, someone's going to bid on them. It's not like they're just not going to be awarded, right? When new requirements come out, that's when the analysis occurs. And if the analysis demonstrates that a set-aside needs to occur, again, those set-asides will be offered up in a request for proposal, and firms would bid on it. So it's not like they have it's not like at the end of the year they would have requirements that nobody's bidding on, right? There are instances where the agency might get one offer, and in those circumstances, they may cancel that requirement and say, we didn't get enough offers, there isn't enough competition, we'll rebid this. But there aren't a lot of instances where they'll be like, wow, I have these 10 requirements and nobody's bidding on them. Does that make sense? Okay. Any other? Yes, ma'am.
Some agencies, like in Arizona, there's the San Carlos Irrigation Project. They operate much like what we call our Salt River Project, which is who we pay our utility bills to. Mm-hmm. San Carlos Irrigation Project is managed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They do have people on staff that have certain thresholds of purchasing and buying power. So, of course, they do the whole SAM and, the contracting, but there's also, I want to say, I don't even know their titles, but they're at a lower level that they have certain purchasing, like maybe up to $50,000 or something like that on special things. So it is really important for small businesses to get to know who those people are, possibly. I mean, not that they're going to hand you a contract, but simply that people do business with people who they know and sometimes like, but I mean, often they're in a rush and they have to do this. So another question that I get from small businesses, why would the federal government purchase something that they can just go to Sam's Club or somewhere and do a large purchase?
Yeah.
And of course, it's kind of going back one step as far as the small business development program.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So they do, agencies do and have the authority to purchase on their purchase cards, up to a certain threshold. And it used to be 5, I think it's gone up to 10. So up to that threshold, they can go to Sam's Club or Amazon or somewhere like that. And there isn't the small business set-aside requirement. Now, a lot of agencies will still try to figure out how to go small, but there's no requirement. And it's really hard to track, because they do it on cards, on the government card. It's really hard to track, are they meeting the socio category, et cetera. Amazon is actually developing and expanding its portal. It originally started in support of state and local governments and their purchase requirements. They've expanded it to potentially the federal government for purchases just like that. And they are developing a system to allow tracking of the firm's size and socio category. But it isn't necessarily tied to DSBS and other places, so it's a little bit of a challenge. But it's that challenge with purchase cards with respect to who you're really buying from, and can they be categorized, and how do we certify or verify that they are who they say they are. But that happens. So you're right, if you develop a relationship with a buying activity under certain thresholds, it can be just a relationship, and they can just put it on a credit card. We used to have training requirements in my program office, which was, I think, like $4,900. And they would come in and do like a training session, and we put that on the credit card. There was no requirement to do the market analysis or any of that. It was under the threshold, you can do that, correct. And there is that authority. Okay, should we keep going, or are we taking a short break? Anybody need a break? Yeah, go ahead.
Hold on. For our online viewers.
Oh, sorry. Does
Yeah.
budget not get spent? We had a consultant, lawyer consultant, that said he specializes in looking at left funds
Yeah.
in certain accounts, and that
Yeah.
he would request SBA letters and kind of work that.
Yeah.
Does that sound like a viable?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So it's not like there's set-asides that don't occur, but a lot of times because of the buying cycle, there's potentially funding at the agency. So the every year, DoD has kind of crazy money because they have multi-year money. Most agencies have annual year money. So every year you get a budget as an agency, and you're supposed to spend it during that fiscal year. So you may start getting towards the end of the year, and you're like, you haven't spent your money. And a lot of agencies are reluctant, unfortunately, and I'm not sure this is the best use of taxpayer dollars, but if agencies don't spend their money, they are fearful that the next budget cycle will come out, and they'll be like, well, you didn't use your $20 million. We're going to cut that out of your budget. Obviously, you didn't need it. So there is a mad rush for awarding contracts in the last quarter of the year, mostly August and September. The reason that 8A is targeted is because 8A is the easy button, and tribal 8As are even an easier button because you can go pretty significantly high. So yes, if an agency hasn't spent their money in the last quarter, they're probably looking to spend it. And if you guys have a solution that the agency might need, it's a good opportunity to approach them. And then, yes, the 8A sole source is probably the easiest button to push. So that's accurate. Yes, ma'am.
Kind of an idea is that also small businesses, it's really important to get involved in these small like business matchmaking events. Of course, we have one at the Reservation Economic Summit, which is fabulous and everybody needs to attend. But what are some other small, I mean, you said industry days. Are there any others
Yeah, I mean,
people
look,
should
so
be
there's-
involved in?
Yeah, so obviously there are other events and opportunities. Like, I think the first week of November is SAMI, Society of American Military Engineers Small Business Conference. If you're in construction, or even infrastructure, also becoming very engineering oriented, even military system engineering oriented. If that's your industry, SAME small business, I call it SAME, some people call it SAME, it's SAME, it's SAME, is a good place to be. That's in November. National 8A conference, that's a good place to be. There's matchmaking, there's networking, there's training, et cetera. The Hub Zone Council, if you're interested in the Hub Zone Council and Hub Zone certification, they have an event, they have matchmaking, they have industry and buyers there. So there are, I mean, Res is huge because there's 3,400 people there, but there are smaller ones. National 8A is pretty large. They have like 2,000 people there, I think. Hub Zone is a little bit smaller. SAME's large, but there are events. And then in addition to that, there are more local events. So like Lackland Air Force Base, if that's one of your targets, they have industry days and matchmaking. They have small business events. So depending on where your target is, I do the research to identify not just the large events, but the localized events as well.
And then real quick for those possibly viewing online or in the room, if they're just starting to think about opening their business, and of course federal contracting is like a couple years away possibly, a business matchmaking event, I'm sure you've participated. Can you give those just an idea of the purpose of it and what that conversation in like 30 seconds kind of might sound like?
Yeah, so you always want to be prepared, right? And if you're just starting off, I mean, it's good to engage and just to get a lay of the land, but don't expect that you're going to get a contract, right? But if you're developed, your firm is providing product and service, you're looking to go to the next step, either expand federal presence or enter the federal presence, I'd do your homework before you got to the matchmaking event, right? And that's the question of who's buying what you're selling, what contracts are expiring, what product or service you have available, do they do a lot of set-asides? Do your homework before you're there. Every like consultant's gonna say this, right? But it's really important to go informed, not just, hey, I'm an 8A or hey, I'm a Hub Zone and I want a contract, because that's not gonna get you the contract. It's, hey, I know you guys buy a lot of widgets. I know you do a lot of set-asides. Guess what? We make widgets. We do excellent work. We've actually done work as a subcontractor, I don't know, for Lockheed Martin making widgets. I see you have some contracts expiring. We'd be really interested in pursuing those. If there's any matchmaking with the program office, if there's any industry days, we'd really love to participate. Those are the top. And by the way, when sole source opportunities come up then, you'll be on top of their mind with respect to, oh, there might be a, you know, there. And by the way, as 8As, the best low-hanging fruit is a sole source opportunity that's expiring where the incumbent 8A has graduated from the program. So if it's a sole source and the incumbent is doing good work, chances are that contract just gets renewed, right? But if the 8A is graduating from the 8A program, so they're in year 9 or have graduated, then they have to find someone to award that sole source to. So that's a good opportunity. Your BOS, Business Opportunity Specialist, again, overworked. They are supposed to do like search letters to agencies. Some of them have such a huge load of 8A firms that most of the work they do is sort of the annual review and compliance stuff and don't have the time to do the search letters. But business opportunity specialists are supposed to issue search letters and try to promote their portfolio of 8A companies with local buying activities to get sole source awards. Yes, sir.
So you mentioned DoD. So the national labs, Sandia, others. We have one, Pacific Northwest, that's kind of hidden up in Washington.
Yeah. Hanford, right?
Yeah. Are those targets for 8A,
Yeah.
or is that too sophisticated to try to penetrate?
No, so that's an interesting, the Department of Energy procures support services for their large labs through what they call M&Os, Management and Operation Contracts. For years, when I was at the SBA, we try to have those broken up because they're so consolidated where they will combine, taking care of the grass, maintenance, small, infrastructure rebuilds, but they'll combine that with PhD, really smart nuclear, processes and disposal of nuclear facility stuff. And then they'll say, oh, well, that's not small business friendly. That has to go to, the large company that can do all those things. For years, we tried to break those out. We weren't successful because they said that will create all sort of security issues with breaking that up. Now, so at a prime level, at those facilities, it's difficult to engage. But those M&O contractors, the ones that have the huge contract, have a requirement to engage with small businesses. So they generally, Hanford and Sandia, will have industry days because they're encouraged to identify the subcontractors to do those types of things that can be done by small businesses, right? In a lot of those facilities, you'll have to have the facility's security clearance, and that's like a chicken and an egg issue as well. So a lot of like DISA, Sandia, DOE requirements will require a securities clearance. Unfortunately, it's like the chicken and the egg because number one, it takes the better part of the year or two to get it. Number two, a lot of times the agency will say, well, we're not going to sponsor a securities clearance because this firm isn't doing work with us. But then they'll say, well, you can't do work with us because you don't have a facilities security clearance. So when we talk about the mentor-protege program and having a mentor subcontract work to you and then sponsor you to get the clearance, that's one way of sort of overcoming the chicken and the egg question. But for entity-owned companies, meaning tribal, NHO, et cetera, getting a clearance is a vital tool, or I don't want to say vital, but it's a unique tool to really expand your opportunities because there's a lot of sole source opportunities that agencies want to go with a trusted source, but you got to have that clearance, right? And so it creates, yes, so there is individual clearance requirements, so people have to be cleared, but the enterprise facilities clearance is the tricky one. I'd say, so if you found a mentor that wanted to so the question was, how long would the FSO security clearance process take? First of all, there's consultants that specialize in just helping you get that clearance, number one. Number two, if you identify a mentor that's going to sponsor you, I mean, we have clients that have, and by the way, the pandemic slowed it down too, so that created a challenge. But we've had clients that have gotten it in 12 to 18 months. Others have taken the better part of 24 months. So it is a time-consuming process. Okay, so how many folks are aware of, I guess nobody wanted to take a break. I'll keep talking. You guys okay? Okay. How many folks know about affiliation? Like what it is, how does it work in government, what are the concerns? Okay, so the first thing I'll say is that tribally owned entities, Alaska Native and NHO, have a lot less to worry about with respect to affiliation. So in almost all instances, your sister companies, 8A number 1, 8A number 2, your service companies, in most instances, those won't be found affiliated and their revenues won't be combined to determine if you are small. Right? So that's for entity owned. A lot less restrictions and a lot less to worry about. For individually owned companies, a lot of times when you're new to federal government, things that you might do in the private sector are all of a sudden a potential issue when you think about your size. And I'll give you a few examples. Common facilities, common ownership, common management. Let's say you're family members and you're like, well, yeah, my brother has this firm. We have it in the same building and we're on each other's board and we own each other's share of the company. Those are all things that you can have a potential finding of affiliation. And then affiliation in itself isn't sort of a bad word, but what SBA will do is if you get protested and they ask for your documents, and then they're like, wait a second, you know, you have common management, facilities, you do prime and sub work all the time, you guys are affiliated, they'll combine the revenues of those two firms to determine if you're still small. So even stuff like, let's say you do a joint venture all the time with this other firm, that can be a potential finding of affiliation. I'll give another example, and my staff is always like, don't say you did that, but we did, unfortunately. When I mentioned that, you know, I used to do federal contracting, right? My dad had started a company. We did economic development, and we did contracts with USAID and World Bank, Asian Development Bank, et cetera. But we oftentimes would prime on a set-aside. And Arthur Andersen or Deloitte or one of the large would be our subcontractor. Number one, when it's a set-aside, the prime is supposed to do 51% of the work, right? So that's number one. In construction, it's less, it's 15%, and in specialty requirements, it's 25%. But if it's a set-aside, the prime contractor has to do 51% of the work. That's number one. Number two, what I would always say is, well, don't worry about it. We got Deloitte. You know, they'll help prepare the proposal. They'll help staff it. Once we start implementing, they can support all that. Well, there's this thing called ostensible subcontracting. If you're unduly reliant on a subcontractor for that contract, then you can be found affiliated. And then SBA is going to combine those two revenues and say, you're not small because your revenue is small, but you're including, you know, Deloitte, you're other than small. And then you end up losing that project, right? So if you're unduly reliant on a subcontractor, that's ostensible subcontracting. That's a potential issue. The common owned, common management, those types of things are definitely a problem. Here's another one. If you have a partner, minority owner, right? You still own 80% or you own 51%, but they've lent a ton of money to the company. Let's say they put up $7 million for you to start off. Well, that's called negative control. Because SBA is going to say, yeah, on paper, it looks like, 51%. On paper, it looks like you can control. But there's really negative control here because you're unduly reliant on that $7 million. Do you really think if, the guy that lent you $7 million says, let's do X, Y, and Z, that you're going to have the power not to do X, Y, and Z? So you have to be aware of negative control issues as well. Again, affiliation in itself is not bad. And I'm not sort of sharing this to raise concerns, but just awareness to make sure that things that we do in the private sector, joint venture, partnerships, teamings, if more than 70% of your revenues come from one source, that's another potential finding of affiliation because you're unduly reliant on that one source. We had, when I was running this program, and I hated the result of this, because we encouraged firms to come and get 8A certified. We had an 8A applicant come in to get certified, right? So went to the 8A office. They started working on the certification. This was an SDVOSB that wanted to also get 8A certified. The analyst said, wait a second, 90% of your revenues comes from this large prime contractor. Sent it over to the size office, and these two offices don't really talk. Sent it over to the size office. The size analyst was like, oh my gosh, you're affiliated. Not only can you not get into the 8A program, but you're no longer an SDVOSB or a small. So the firm came in to get 8A certified, but ended up getting kicked out of all of the small business programs. So it's just awareness, and I'm not saying that's going to happen, but it's just awareness to make sure that the way the government looks at these things is really different than a private sector. And the other thing that really frustrates me also is they look at the totality of the circumstances. So there's no clear line that says common ownership, prime subcontracting relationships, and a joint venture equals affiliation. Depends on whose desks it ends up on with respect to the size specialist, and they look at the totality of the circumstances. Now you can appeal to Office of Hearing and Appeals, but they could potentially hold up that finding.
Thank you, sir. You mentioned negative control issues.
Yeah.
Is that does that help prevent, for lack of better words, like vultures from coming in and people? It kind of protects the sanctity of the whole system, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, ultimately what the SBA is looking for is making sure that the disadvantaged individual that the certification is based on, or the disadvantaged entity, like the entity ones, not only own but control. Now again, as entity owned, as a tribal entity, you can have an investor that comes in and owns 49%, but you have to demonstrate through the operating agreement and through the control measures that at the end of the day, the tribe or the Alaska Native owner controls not just day-to-day decision-making, but strategic operations of the company.
Gunakchish, thank you.
Yeah. Yes. What kind of? Oh, leased employees. Yes.
They're under our control.
Yeah.
So is that a viable path?
Yeah. So leased employees are most often considered an employee of the firm. So it's okay that you lease them. You're not going to be found affiliated with, if they are in the business of leasing employees. So not like it's your competitor or your partner and they're like, hey, we're going to lease you these guys and we're going to go get contracts. If the company is in the business of leasing employees and providing staff, then that has been found not to be affiliated with that employee leasing company. That's a good question. And by the way, for HubZone purposes, they can count towards your HubZone employee count. Yeah, yeah. Any other questions? Okay, so I'm gonna run, we've talked about a lot of these programs because I do want to get into mentor-protege and then just spend a couple minutes on the current trends. But I'm gonna, so on the certification programs, we've sort of talked about what the basic requirements of the programs are, right? 8A is socially disadvantaged and economically disadvantaged. Always think about the individual, and that was a great question, always think about that the individual or entity that is getting the certification has to own and control. Own alone doesn't meet the mark, right? Owning 51%, but not controlling doesn't meet the mark. So the disadvantaged individual, woman-owned, service-disabled, 8A, has to own and control, and then be small, right? And then in the 8A, it's socially and economically disadvantaged. In HubZone, it's, is my principal office in a HubZone? Again, tribes have an exemption. Principal office isn't your headquarters. And is 35% of my employees live in a HubZone? And again, those employees don't have to live in the same HubZone. They can live in any HubZone. And you can have interns and you can lease employees as long as they are from a leasing, employee leasing entity. There was and is an issue that the SBA is concerned about. There were some leasing firms that were leasing the same 8 hours of an employee like 10 times to 10 different companies. That's clearly not allowed. My position has been with the SBA, you can't punish the HubZone companies. How would they know that one employee is being leased 10 times? So there's a lot of discussion about that. That's just be cautious as a HubZone entity if you're using the HubZone, if you're using the leased employee as a HubZone employee to meet program requirements, make sure that the company you're working with is a legitimate company and is on the up and up. That's one concern. So 8A HubZone, women-owned, again. Oh, the one thing I'll mention on women-owned is a woman-owned set-aside is unique because it can occur only in certain NAICS codes, right? So the SBA had to do a study to determine where women-owned firms were underrepresented. So which industries? So that study, actually originally when it was done, came out with one industry. And this was like in the 1990s. And so the program really didn't take off until like 2010 when under the Obama administration, there was a study supported by, I think, RAND, but we did an analysis and came up with 50 industries. And that was expanded in 2013, I think, to 113 industries, and just last year it was expanded again. So there is a good number of industries where women-owned set-asides can occur. In the Women-Owned Small Business Program, you can certify as a WOSB or get certified as a WOSB, or an economically disadvantaged women-owned small business. I used to call them, actually, I didn't used to call them that. It was WOSB and Ed Wosby. And at first, when they used to say Ed Wosby, I was like, who's Ed? It's like Ed Wosby, but it's Wosby. They call him Wosby and Ed Wosby. And if you're an Ed Wosby, you're a Wosby, but if you're a Wosby, you're not necessarily an Ed Wosby, right? To be an Ed Wosby, I mean, if you qualify, I would definitely get certified. You have, in addition to being a female, you have the economic requirements that you do in the 8A program, right? So are you economically disadvantaged, those thresholds? The last thing that I'd say on, something came to my mind and I was like, oh, I need to mention that. Any questions so far on the cert? Yes, ma'am.
Is there a list that comes out every year so that if you're a small business, you know
Where to look?
what might fit you and what to go after?
Yeah, so unfortunately, yes and no. So the analysis that I was sort of mentioning with USA Spend is really an analysis that, and by the way, there's systems like, you know, Bloomberg Government and FedMine and others that will charge you, I mean, they're expensive, but they'll make it easier, right? But they're very expensive, especially for startups. I will say that the SBA, through 7J, which is funding a lot of these trainings, has bid speed available for free. So if you go to the SBA site, you look at 7J, bid speed, that's one of the tools. But you can also just use USA Spending. So on the one hand, there isn't like a list out there, but you can do the research to see where set-asides occur, which ones are expiring, and that sort of thing. But you have to have some data analytics capability. On the other hand, there are OSDBU and Office of Small Business Program forecasts. Those forecasts aren't always the best and aren't regularly updated. But as an example, NASA, if you go to their Small Business Program office, they have a forecast. And they'll have like what's going to be coming out, is it going to be women-owned, 8A, who's the incumbent, that sort of thing. So there are disparate sources of information between the forecasts, the Office of Small Business Programs, and what you can pull and analyze out of USA Spend. Does that make sense? What else was I going to say? So I was talking about the 8A sole source, woman-owned, hub zone. I forget now. I'm sure it'll come up. Ownership, control important, small important. The one thing that I'll say is the other socio-categories, women-owned, hub zone, service disabled, have sole source authority. It's just not like the 8A, right? Under the sole source thresholds in the 8A program, contracting officer can issue it without J&A. In the other socio-categories, hub zone, women-owned, service disabled, they have to demonstrate that you are the only woman-owned small business that can provide this product or service. And then that justification has to be approved by the head of contracting activity. And because contracting officers are a lot of times risk averse, a lot of sole source awards don't happen in the other socio-categories. They happen in the 8A program. We used to work and have worked with contracting officers to be creative around the only firm criteria. Like if they can demonstrate, okay, well this is the only woman-owned small business in this geographical area that can provide the product or service, that's been approved before. Or if they can demonstrate that, okay, this is the only women-owned small business with this particular past performance or experience, that's been approved before. But the contracting officer would have to want to do that and sort of stick their neck out on the line to get that approval. That's why set-asides sole source doesn't happen as often in the other socio categories. Anything on the certification programs before we jump into mentor protege? Yes.
For certification, actually on Monday,
Oh,
for woman-owned small business
awesome.
and economically disadvantaged women-owned small. So I have no idea, like, how long does that take?
So number one, awesome that you got it in. Number two, SBA has a enormous backlog.
I bet.
So you can, I mean, I don't encourage people to pay for it, but you can get a third-party certification. For WOSB and EdWOSB, as opposed to 8A and HubZone, you can get a third-party certification, like WeBank, and I'm not promoting them. There's 3 others that I can't think of right now. And then all you have to do is take that certification and give it to SBA, and they accept it. But right now, there's a significant, so it's supposed to be 90 days, right? It's, in 90 days, think 3 months. It's probably closer to 4 to 6 months. We had an application that we worked with a client on. We submitted it in August. Last week, they got a notification saying, because what'll happen is, just like in the 8A program, when you submit, they will analyze a first level review and say, okay, it's accepted for processing. And if it doesn't get accepted for processing, they'll come back and ask a whole bunch of questions. And hopefully you answer them and then it gets accepted. So that time frame is supposed to take 15 days, the first level review. In the 8A program, it probably takes closer to 30 to 60 days because they stop the clock every time they send you a question. And they usually don't get that first question in the first 15 days anyways. So that's number one. Once it gets accepted for processing, it's supposed to take 90 days, but it can take 4 to 6 months. We had an application go in August. In the third week of October, are we in the fourth week? Third week of October, they got a message saying, hey, we have a backlog. We haven't even gone through the first level review on your application. So they had not even done the first level, and that was since August, so 2 months, already 60 days. Okay, sorry. But the one thing that I would do is continually track it, because we've had applicants where SBA asked a question, they didn't go in there and track it, they didn't respond, SBA closed out the application. So continually track, go into certify and track it. And if it goes to like 40 days and you're not getting a response, reach out to the National Center. We can ping the SBA and be like, what's going on with this application? Okay? Any other, yes, sir.
Can you acquire past performance through like an acquisition of another firm or something like that?
Yeah, so for tribally owned entities, I mean, even for individual owned firms, yeah, that's a way of jumpstarting your participation in the program, right? A lot of tribal and entity owned firms do that, because when we do this analysis, right, let's say you realize that, well, yeah, we're selling widgets, but the government only uses the GSA schedule and OASIS or Alliant or CIO-SP4. So why don't we just buy a firm that already has all those contracts, right? That way, we inherit those contracts. We don't have to organically build up our organization over the next 5 years. So acquisition is definitely. Now, there are challenges with acquiring an existing or a graduated 8A, because technically you're not supposed to sell 8A contracts. So there's all sorts of waiver requirements or change of ownership requirements that you'd have to go through at the SBA if you acquired a existing or graduated 8A, but they can be overcome. I mean, you can definitely use acquisition as a way to jumpstart your entrance into the marketplace. Yeah. Any other questions?
What happens after 8A? What happens to you?
So that's also a good question. Firms, if you're growing, there are firms that'll really take advantage of the program and successfully graduate, get weaned off of sole source, and grow to be or either remain small but out of the 8A program, or grow to be large, successful companies, or get bought out. There are firms that don't necessarily figure out the 8A program and never significantly benefit from it. They graduate after 9 years and they continue to, if they can survive, they survive. And then there are firms that are successful, and I kind of considered it the post-8A program, because then they can become a mentor and partner up with a new entrant to 8A and mentor them, create a joint venture, and go after the contracts that are expiring that they were the incumbent on. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the Mentor Protege program, because mentors are being a mentor as you graduate is a good opportunity, and partnering with a mentor instead of acquisition to grow is another good opportunity as well. Anything else on? Yes, ma'am.
One question on 8A. If they graduated out, can they have another 8A in a different NAICS code?
So tribes, the entity owned, yes. Individuals, no. For individuals, it's a once in a lifetime bite at the apple. For tribes, they can have multiple 8As and NHOs and Native Hawaiian organizations. Correct. Any other questions? Let's talk about Mentor Protege. So Mentor Protege originally started in the 8A program. It wasn't statutory. The SBA thought newer 8A companies could probably, as part of their, because it's a business development program, could probably benefit from partnering with a larger mentor. So the concept behind it is you have certain areas that you need help in, right? The first 5 bullets. And the help doesn't have to be in all of these categories. But 2 things I'd be cautious about. In your entire lifetime as a small business, you can only have 2 mentors. So you want to pick wisely. Now, again, entity owned, your first 8A can have 2 mentors, but your second 8A can have 2 more, and your third 8A can have 2 more. But for individually owned companies, in your entire lifetime, you can have 2 mentors. So I would pick wisely. And the other part of it is, you don't want to just say, hey, I'm going to find a mentor and we're going to go after set-aside contracts. There has to be some benefits flowing from mentor to protege. And when you apply to the SBA, they're going to want to see that. And so these are the 5 areas that SBA sort of categorizes as areas where benefits will flow from mentor to protege. And you don't have to have all of them, right? A lot of people don't have international trade, or a lot of people don't have financial assistance. As part of the benefits, one of them can be contracting. And as part of that benefit, you can say, yeah, well, we're going to create a joint venture and go after set-aside contracts. But that can't be the only thing that's going to flow from mentor to protege. Now, why do a joint venture? A joint venture is for all intents and purposes, and almost in every instance, although sometimes it won't be a separate legal entity, but in almost every instance that I've worked on, and we have a lot of clients that do this, and what I used to see at the SBA, and it's just cleaner, is a new legal entity where the protege is at least 51% owner, right? And again, the designation is flowing from the protege. So not only does the protege have to be 51% owner, but they have to also control. So you can't have any unanimous consent provisions where you have to have the authority or the blessing of the mentor to be able to do X, Y, and Z. There are some extraordinary circumstances where SBA has said, okay, that makes sense to have unanimous consent. But in almost every instance, the protege needs to control, just like the disadvantaged individual would need to control, right? But why create the joint venture? So when the protege is the 51% owner, the protege inherits the the JV inherits the size and status of the protege. So you're creating a new joint venture legal entity, but it becomes a tribal 8A or an NHO 8A or an individual 8A. As such, it has access to the same contracting set-asides, also or sole source opportunities. The other benefit is that the JV inherits, right? It inherited size and status from protege, but it inherits past performance and qualifications from both members. So now you have a tribal 8A that has not only your qualifications, but the qualifications of your mentor, which could potentially be Lockheed. So it makes it super competitive. Now, this was launched, so it used to only be in the 8A program. It got launched to all small businesses as a result of the Small Business Jobs Act of 2010. It took the better part of 6 years before we were able to launch it in 2016. There's been a lot of questions on the Hill about, are these really too competitive and are they displacing individual small businesses? Because they win contracts all the time. They win the big GWACs and the STARS 3s and the CIOSP 4s and the OASIS. So have we created something that's way too competitive? Now, there's benefits flowing to the protege, that's for sure. Why does the mentor want to do this? One, they have requirements to engage with the community, provide benefits to the community. They have community development programs. But two, they get to participate in a set-aside contract or a sole source contract where otherwise they wouldn't be able to. And remember when I said the prime has to do 51%? When there's a JV, not the managing member, which would be the protege, the non-managing member, which is the mentor, can do up to 60% of the contract. So now you have a set-aside contract that has all the a corporate entity that has all of the qualifications of the mentor and the protege. It has the size and status of the protege, which is an 8A, and can go after opportunities, and the mentor can do 60% of the work. Does that all make sense? Any questions? Yes, yes, sir.
As far as how the work is broken down, yeah, like how does that? What does that mean? That the 60-40 split?
Yeah.
Is it like cost based, or are they looking at?
That's a great question. It used to be labor based. SBA changed the rules when they actually released the similarly situated, which is another thing we should talk about. Now we're down to 10 minutes, I'm sorry. It used to be labor-based, but it was changed to dollar-based. So the SBA and the contracting officer would look at the total dollar value and then determine the dollar-wise who's doing what. Generally speaking, the way it's structured is that the contract gets awarded to the joint venture, and then each of the members to the joint venture basically get a subcontract from the joint venture. And the value of that subcontract should be 60-40. Now, the joint venture can also have a subcontractor. And I know this is getting in the weeds and complicated, but the joint venture is a prime contractor. As a prime contractor, they have to do at least 51% of the work. The joint venture can do 100% of the work, but they have to do at least 51% of the work. Of the work that the joint venture does, it has to be split 60-40. Does that make sense? And by the way, certain supplies can be excluded from that six. So if you're buying cloud computing services, that's one of the things that can be excluded before you look at the 60-40%. Or if you're buying just supplies like computer hardware, that can be excluded before you calculate the 60-40 split. Yes, sir.
So as the protege, I could hire a subcontractor and that becomes my 40%?
No. So you have to do 40% of the work that the JV does. As a JV, you can hire a subcontractor to do 49% of the work, right? Now, the JV has to do 60-40, right? So that 51% can be split 60-40. after you lop off the 49% that can go to a subcontractor. But the JV, the protege has to do 40% of what the JV does. Yes, sir.
So with this like increase in the amount of work that the partner can do, is this because of, you know, this mentor protege relationship, so that, say, because you're in this relationship and you are formally in a process of growing with assistance, that this larger entity can absorb some of that, like administrative kind of things or whatever that you might be lacking?
Correct. Absolutely. That's the intent of the program, right? It's sort of a business development program. And when you do that analysis with respect to the benefits, it's like what I would say, because you only get 2 mentors, is that I would do a gap analysis. Like, what are we missing? Are we missing contract writing capacity, networking capacity, pipeline development capacity, or are we missing infrastructure, project implementation, operational stuff? Put that as assistance flowing from mentor to protege. When we advise a protege, we're like, be really specific, like name what's going to happen, who's going to provide it, when, and it's a 3+3 program, right? So 3 years plus another 3 years. When we're advising the mentor, we're like, yeah, you might want to make it a little bit wishy-washy because you have to report on this annually, right? So you have to report what benefits are flowing, and if you do a joint venture, you have to report your performance of work. So to the mentor, you want to put something in there that you're definitely going to be able to deliver. To the protege, you want to put in there something that you really need. There's a happy medium somewhere in the middle, and sometimes we work both with the mentor and the protege. There's a happy medium to say, look, our needs are X, Y, and Z. We need that from a mentor, but let's word it this way to make sure it's something that we can work against and report success to the SBA. At the 3-year mark, it gets renewed for another 3 years. They're supposed to analyze the benefits flowing and then renew it for the 3 years. Technically speaking, it's almost pretty automatic, but if you can't show any benefits flowing, you might not get renewed for the second 3 years. And yes, because of the mentor-protege relationship, you're exempted from any affiliation to your mentor. That's why you can create that joint venture. If you didn't have the MPA and you did a joint venture with a large, SBA would say you're other than small, we're going to combine your revenues. Because you have that MPA, you're exempted from affiliation. So the assistance that they provide, sometimes they'll provide space, assistance, all those things are exempted from affiliation. And then the other thing that I'd throw in there is that we don't necessarily recommend this, but we have some clients that do this, is the mentor can invest up to 40% into your equity and inject capital without any fear of affiliation. If a large firm did that without the MPA, you have potentially the finding of affiliation. But because you have the MPA creating that protection from affiliation, the mentor can inject up to 40% and take 40% of equity. The challenge that I have is, what is the exit strategy? Like, go in with eyes wide open, and when you have that purchase agreement to acquire 40%, also have an exit strategy. Like, what's the valuation going to be? You guys might be super successful, and then you might think here, and they might think here, and then you're going to have an argument. So always go in eyes wide open and have a clear understanding of what that exit strategy is going to look like. The other thing that I'd say is that once you create that joint venture, there used to be a 3-2 rule that for the life of me would always confuse me when I was responsible for the program. They simplified it to the 2 rule, the 2-year rule. So when you create that joint venture, it's good for 2 years. Not 2 years from the date of creation, 2 years from the date of first contract award. There's always a discussion and debate of what's a contract award. I think the agency has settled on a contract award is a first prime award, federal prime award to the joint venture. 5 minutes? federal prime award to the joint venture. So you have 2 years. But if you have your mentor-protege relationship, you can always establish JV number 2, JV number 3, and JV number 4. SBA won't find affiliation. They have held out that at some point one JV is going to be one too many, but in all my years that I was at the SBA and since, there's never been a finding of affiliation, and we've had, mentor proteges with like 5 or 6 JVs. So the risk of potential affiliation through the creation of JVs under an MPA isn't there. Now, you could always do a small to small JV where, let's say you're a tribal entity, you have an 8A, but you don't have the right capacity and performance background and past performance. You can do a small to small JV with another small business and not risk affiliation. But if you keep, and by the way, the JV inherits past performance and quals from both members, and the non-51% can also do 60% of the work again. But you can't do JV2, JV3, JV4 because probably after JV2, SBA is going to find you to be affiliated. So if you don't have an MPA, you would want to restrict the number of JVs you do with the same small business. And you can only do small to small without an MPA. I think you had a question.
Yeah, I'm wondering about if there is a place where you can find information about the performance of these kind of partnerships, because like when you're saying that like this larger firm could inject 40% of your capital, and you're saying like, you'd be wary about that because what's going to happen after that. But in, say, like a best case scenario, you have like a real mentor relationship that's trying to help you build capacity. Say, this big chunk of investment will lead you to a larger income that you can buy yourself out of that potentially.
Yeah. No, I think, so there, unfortunately, and this is the whole question of how are mentor-protege joint ventures performing and really what has been the impact of it. There is no central database of what's occurred. There is a list that the SBA keeps of all the approved mentor-proteges that the program has approved since its inception. But there's no being able to delve into it and expand on the experience. Now, the SBA collects the annual reports, but again, those aren't really analyzed and synthesized into any kind of report either. And there isn't an official sort of matchmaking of mentors and proteges that exists, right? It's more like a marriage. You develop it over time with someone that you've probably a firm you've worked with. I would be concerned with respect, again, to the 2 limits. You have 2, and then the cultures. You want to make sure that all those things work and there's actual benefits flowing from mentor to protege, because it is like a marriage. And the protege can only have 2 mentors. A mentor is also selective because they can have 1 but up to 3 proteges at any given point. So they can cycle them in and out. But like a Lockheed, with all their divisions and subsidiaries and everything, can ever only have 3 at any given point, right? So they're super selective as well. So it is really like a marriage. You meet a lot of these folks on industry days and matchmaking and stuff like that, and it's a relationship that's built over time. Now, with respect to what we talked about, and I know I'm down to a minute, I didn't get a chance to talk about trends, but I'll be here this afternoon at the roundtable if we're having that at 3. With respect to the FSO and security clearance, what we see a lot of times is if the mentor puts that as part of the benefits flowing from mentor to protege, they sponsor them. They have a cleared contract, right? They award a subcontract to their protege or to the joint venture, or more likely than not to the protege, and then they sponsor the protege to get their clearance. And that's sort of the chicken and the egg, where the agency's like, well, we're not clearing you because you don't have a contract, but then they say we're not going to give you a contract because you don't have clearance. But if your mentor sponsors you, you can overcome that chicken and egg issue. I didn't get a chance to talk about trends. I would look at and just be aware of category management. Category management, when I talk about the government-wide acquisition vehicles like OASIS, CIOSP4, those types of vehicles. And in all honesty, the reason why the mentor-protege came about and similarly situated came about was a reaction of all the consolidation and bundling that's going on. Individual firms weren't able to win STARS 3 or Alliant or OASIS or CIOSP4. And the government said, well, why don't we create a mentor-protege program and allow them to team up with a mentor so they can win some of these contracts. So it's worked, but what's the consequence of it working? But I would look at those government-wide vehicles. The GSA has a really good landing page for category management. It's not small business friendly. I mean, individual outstanding contracts have shrank like by thousands over the last 5 to 7 years because the contracts are now being routed through these category management vehicles as opposed to standalone individual contracts. And if you're not on one of these vehicles, you're not getting the contract. So it has had a negative impact on small business participation. However, the large firms that win it have a really strong subcontracting requirement, so that's an opportunity. And the data that they keep on their landing page on category management, if you do GSA category management, Google it, you'll get to their GSA website, to the category management website. The data that they keep on the vehicles is pretty useful and user-friendly with respect to who's winning, what they're winning, how they're winning. So it's a good place to do some research. I apologize I didn't get to that. I didn't think I would talk for 2 hours. Thank you guys for being patient and listening and being interactive. That's really awesome, and that always makes it more interesting for both sides. So thank you guys for being here today. Thank you.